Good morning, students. Today we are going to learn 2.4 The Fall of Troy, Part 2. In the earlier part, we have seen that the war between the Trojans and the Greeks continued for 9 years. Even the Greeks could not enter in the city of Troy, and the Trojans were unable to send the Greeks back. In this part, we are going to see what happened next. The city of Troy was taken back, not honestly, but using a trick. The cunning Odysseus led the Greek army. At last, Troy was taken, not by force, but by a trick. It was the cunning Odysseus who thought of a plan to obtain the victory. The cunning Odysseus made a plan to win the war, but it was a cunning plan. "Let us build a great wooden horse," he said, "big enough to hold men inside it, and let some of our best fighters hide in the horse. Then let us burn our tents and let us burn our tents and pretend to sail away in our ships. But instead of sailing away, we will return in the night. When the Trojans are asleep, we will attack the city and burn and kill." The Greek leaders decided to follow the advice of the wise Odysseus. So a great horse of wood was made by a skillful engineer, and the greatest heroes like Menelaus, Odysseus himself, and others entered it. The last man to go in, being the architect himself, who knew the secret of opening and shutting the entrance. That evening, the Greeks burned the tent and sailed away in their ships. But they did not go very far. Only one man was left behind to persuade the Trojans to drag the horse into their city. Next day, the Trojans woke up, expecting to go out and fight as they had done for the past 10 years. What delight and surprise they felt at the sight they saw on the seashore outside the walls. It seemed that the long siege was over at last. The tents had been burnt. The shore was deserted. The Greek ships had all gone. "It's a peace at last," they cried. They cried and opened wide their gates and came out in large numbers on the plain, glad to be free again to go where they pleased. It means they were very happy because they were free to go wherever they want. Then they saw on the sands the huge wooden horse. They gathered round it in astonishment. So they were surprised to see such a wooden horse. for it was indeed a wonderful piece of work. As they were wondering how the horse had been built and why it had been left behind, they found a Greek with his hands tied together lying under it. When the Trojans dragged him out, the man pretended to be very frightened of them. The architect pretended and showed that he was very much afraid to the Trojans. When he was commanded to tell them why the Greeks had gone and why they had left this horse behind, again the architect pretended and said in a trembling way, and he refused to speak. When at last they three turned to kill him, he spoke and told them this false tale. Then he told them the false story. The Greeks are tired of the long war and have sailed away in their ships, he said. But they are afraid of the long voyage home too. That's why they have made this horse and left it as an offering to the god of the sea. They wanted also to kill me and offer me as a sacrifice to the sea god, but I escaped and hid from them. So he said that I could escape myself and concealed from them. But why did the Greeks make such a huge horse? Such a big, wonderful horse? Some of the Trojans asked, and the cunning Greek made this reply: if they had made a smaller offering, you might have taken it into your city. Then the luck would have gone to the Trojans and not to the Greeks. That's why. Therefore, they made it too big to go inside your gates. That is why they have made such a big wooden horse that the Trojans would not be able to drag the horse in. The Trojans were delighted to hear this. The Trojans became happy after hearing this. The Greeks have gone, they said, and the walls are no longer necessary. Let's make a hole in the wall and drag the horse in. Their wise priest warned them not to do so. It may be a trick that will ruin us, that will destroy us, he said. You will bring disaster on the city if you break down the walls. The priest warned the Trojans, but they were so excited that they paid no attention to his words. They broke down part of their strong wall in order to drag the horse in. All that day, the Trojans feasted and drank and celebrated. After all their celebrations, they went to sleep and slept soundly. But that day of rejoicing was soon followed by a night of terror and death. The Greek ships had not sailed far. As soon as they were hidden by an island, they had lowered their sails and dropped anchor and waited for the night. In the darkness, the fleet sailed back, and the leading ship, which was Agamemnon's, bore a red light high on its mast. The Greek, who was watching for the return of the fleet, crept to the wooden horse and gave the signal. The side of the horse opened. The Greeks climbed out and opened the gates. The whole Greek army entered the sleeping city. Immediately the Greeks set fire to houses and towers and palaces and began to burn and kill. In this way, the Greeks had used a trick and they started destroying the Trojans. Troy was filled with the sight of leaping, flames, and the sound of shouting, and the noise of weapons, and the cries of weeping women. The sleeping Trojans sprang out of their beds, but they were taken by surprise. Their enemies were right inside their walls, and many of the Trojans were killed before they could put on their armor and seize their weapons. A bright light lit up the night sky as palaces and houses, temples and towers went up in flames. The Trojans fought as well as they could, but it was all in vain. Old King Priam was killed with all his brave sons. Hector's wife and his old mother and sister were carried off as slaves by the conquerors. Their fate was in contrast to Helen's when King Menelaus rushed through the city looking for her and found her in her palace. She hung her head in shame and sorrow as she faced her former husband. Her voice was choked with emotion and she could not speak. But Menelaus forgave her and she went back with him, for it was only Aphrodite who had turned her heart away from her home and her husband and her child. When morning came, nothing was left of the proud, rich city that had resisted attack for 10 years. So students, we came to know that the city of Troy, which was prosperous, fully developed, was taken back because Odysseus had used a cunning trick to defeat the Trojans. So we have to be aware from such cunning people. Thank you.